It is finally time. I've done a full Let's Play of the game. I've played through the game again in New Game Plus. I've done some post-game challenge stuff. I've talked to people in the community about the game. And I've let the game simmer for a little bit. And now it is time to give my full review of Final Fantasy XVI. And let me tell you, I have a lot to say. In fact, if I'm being honest, it's going to get pretty heated in here. This is a very important game. It is pivotal for Final Fantasy moving forward. I'm not going to hold back any of my criticisms or thoughts just for the sake of a safe review that makes everybody happy and everyone feel tingly on the inside and doesn't push anybody's buttons. Listen, this is a very important game, both for Square Enix and for the entire industry. And they need to know what works in this game and what doesn't work in this game for us, the consumer, so that the industry doesn't just become a bunch of derivative nonsense. I know that sometimes people can take my criticisms as anger, but I want you to know that it isn't anger, it's passion. I have been in the industry for over 15 years, and I have personally seen the effects that public discourse has on Square Enix and the gaming industry as a whole. It is very important to me that I take what seems to be the most important in my little niche community and display it in a way that these people can see it and potentially genuinely think about making changes. Game developers truly want to know what works and what doesn't work for us as the consumer, and they need to hear our voices. What Final Fantasy XVII looks like when it reaches our hands depends on what we say now. So I have a lot to say about Final Fantasy XVI, both good and bad. But before we get there, we need to talk about two controversies that surrounded the game on its launch. The first big controversy was a big movement surrounding the game trying to discuss whether or not it even belongs in the Final Fantasy series. Listen, Final Fantasy XVI is the least Final Fantasy game in the entire series, and it's not even close. So if you want to be upset about it not really fitting into the series as well as the other games, that is 100% valid. In fact, I feel the same way. Final Fantasy has always been a series that tries different things. Square Enix has always tried to push it to be the next innovative game, still fitting within its own narrative, but it's always a new story, it always has new mechanics, etc., etc. Final Fantasy has always kind of been a milestone series for Square. It's always the best game they can possibly make with the crew they currently have. But it does feel like Final Fantasy XVI went a bit too far. It definitely alienates long-running fans of the series as a trade-off to attract more of a general audience. However, we shouldn't be pushing a narrative that Final Fantasy XVI isn't actually a Final Fantasy and somehow doesn't fit into the series. The people that worked on this game are truly passionate about Final Fantasy, and they did their best to create a Final Fantasy experience that would make everybody happy. You may agree or disagree with Final Fantasy being pushed towards a more general audience, but that's just the decision that Square Enix decided to make. That is modern Final Fantasy. If you dislike modern Final Fantasy, that's fine. I have read so many toxic things online about how Square Enix has destroyed the Final Fantasy series and that they hate their old fans. And I just wish these people would understand that modern Final Fantasy is extremely successful. There are many people who love and adore modern Final Fantasy. It's not that Square Enix is trying to destroy their own fan base. It's just that you don't like modern Final Fantasy. You are a retro Final Fantasy fan, and that is okay. You are allowed to like only retro Final Fantasy for any reason that you want. But you shouldn't be wishing harm on Square Enix employees or yelling at content creators just because they make content on the modern Final Fantasies. Now, I understand and agree that Final Fantasy XVI pushes it too far. There are too many gameplay mechanics, values, and just things that we love about Final Fantasy that aren't in Final Fantasy XVI. But having said that, there are many people who will play Final Fantasy XVI who have never touched a Final Fantasy game, love it, and maybe will venture into the old games. Hopefully, by showing Square Enix that this is too far of a step outside of the series, they will rein it in for Final Fantasy XVII and we'll get a game that we can all enjoy. The second controversy we need to talk about are the timely accessories. Now, for those of you that don't know, The timely accessories are basically accessibility options. They are available to you from the start, and they basically make the game either easier or more accessible depending on the accessory. The controversy comes in with the way they were implemented. A small pop-up comes up in the game to let you know about these accessories and tells you to equip them if you are feeling overwhelmed. There is also an icon in the top left-hand corner showing that you have them equipped, and they all have the word timely in their name. However, this was not enough for a lot of people to realize that these are strictly accessibility options and can easily mess with the balance of the game if equipped. There were some people that knew they were accessibility options and still equipped them and enjoyed their playthrough even more so because of it. And of course, there were plenty of people that understood what they were, kept them off, and enjoyed their playthrough as normal. However, there were a lot of people that knew, including myself, that there would be people out there that would not understand this concept, equip the timely accessories as if they were a normal equipment, and then complain that the game is too easy. When I first saw the timely accessories in my inventory during my Let's Play, I said this: for us, it's not a big deal. We know what this is. We know not to equip them. But I can guarantee you, and I haven't seen it yet, but I guarantee you there's a bunch of people right now complaining about these online. I guarantee it. There's a Reddit thread right now of people like, why do these rings make the whole game easy? Why, this game's so easy. This game, blah, blah, blah. And wouldn't you know it, right after I said that, this clip went viral of somebody eating a sandwich and playing the game, trying to show that it was too easy, even though you can see, obviously, that he has the timely accessories equipped. Or maybe not. Yeah, so this is a bit of a side tangent, and it would be a lot easier just to jump on the bandwagon, but I gotta stick up for what is right. This guy does not have the timely accessories equipped in this video. There are a ton of comments on this post that are making the same point that I am about people equipping these accessories and then calling the game easy, and that is legitimately a problem. But I gotta stick up for this guy. That is not what's going on here. He is simply making the argument that the combat in Final Fantasy XVI is boring because he can beat this boss with one hand. Now, to play devil's advocate here, this is one of the first battles in the game, so obviously it's going to be pretty easy, but still, this is a valid argument to make, and he even made a rebuttal post later showing that he didn't have the accessories equipped and doing the fight again blindfolded. So although I wouldn't completely agree that this is a great argument as to why Final Fantasy XVI's combat is boring, this is still a very valid argument, and I apologize to this guy for all of the people that wrongly accused him of equipping the timely accessories. There is even an official note on one of the posts about this video, linking an IGN article and saying that the person in the video is using multiple accessibility options, which is great to see on other posts where people are maliciously equipping the accessories and then talking about how easy the game is. But again, not on this guy's video. He does not have the timely accessories equipped. Now, having said that, reading through all these comments, you can still tell that this is a big problem. A lot of people were frustrated with the fact that the accessories were way too easy for people to equip, and it really threw off a lot of people's idea of what the combat was really supposed to be. The most important takeaway from this are the comments from people saying that they weren't going to try the game at all because they saw posts about how easy the game was, which could have easily been influenced from people that equipped the timely accessories. Again, I do want to reiterate, because I know a lot of people will point this out, it is perfectly okay to equip these accessories. It is perfectly okay whether or not you have an issue with the game's difficulty to equip these accessories, or play the game on easy mode and enjoy your playthrough just as everyone else does. The issue is the public discourse. The issue is people going online talking about how easy the game is without playing it in its normal balanced difficulty state without these accessories equipped. In today's age, stuff like this really does affect how a game sells, and the way the game sells affects how much budget goes into the next game, which is important to us, the Final Fantasy fans. This is why talking about stuff like this is important, and it's why I hate reading comments like this just telling people to not equip the accessories. This misses the entire point of the argument. It's not about my playthrough. My playthrough, I unequipped the accessories and played through as I normally would. What it does is it affects the general public discourse of the game, which will affect Square Enix moving forward. Now, before I talk a little bit more about how the rings were implemented, I need to say, these are some of the best accessibility options I have ever seen in a video game. The attention to detail that these rings have is remarkable. They are very detailed and target very specific issues that specific people will have with the game without forcing them to play a mode that completely changes the way the game works. For those of you that have been around my channel for a while, you may know that my wife works in special education, and we have adopted 2 children, both with their own special needs. The other day, one of my sons came up to me and asked me to play video games with him. So I brought him over to my shelf of games and let him pick a game. Out of all the games that he could have picked, he walked right up to the N64 games and picked Super Mario 64. This was like a magic dad moment for me. I think that we all wish that our kids would grow up with the same games that we played and have that same connection to them. But a lot of times that just kind of doesn't happen. Either the games feel a bit too old for them, or they just struggle with them too much and would rather play the more modern games that are honestly fit a lot better for kids. And of course, I don't want to force my childhood on him. If he had picked the new Paw Patrol game, it's not like I'm going to knock it out of his hands and be like, nope, you got to grow up and struggle with ghosts and goblins like we had to. But this was a special moment because he picked Super Mario 64 on his own. He genuinely wanted to play it. I hadn't forced it upon him. So I'm all excited and I put the game in and I hand him the controller, and I quickly realized that he isn't really equipped for Super Mario 64. The biggest issue was his reaction time. His reaction time is not as good as other kids his age, and it caused him to struggle in many areas that I didn't as a kid. Not only that, but some levels were completely gatekeeped for him. Now that's just one small example, and to be honest, he had a blast just running around the castle anyways. But the point is, accessibility options matter. One of the timely accessories in Final Fantasy XVI would be perfect for my son as it specifically targets reaction time. Now, it's going to be a long time before my son plays Final Fantasy XVI because, but other companies will be looking at Final Fantasy XVI as a success story and seeing how they can implement these accessories into their own games. Having said all that, I do agree that the implementation of these timely accessories is really unfortunate. There needed to be another barrier between the player and the accessories to let the player know that these are for specific players, and if you do equip them, it will change your general experience of the game. Many people said that there should have been an option in the menu to turn the timely accessories on and off, which would also be nice so that they weren't sitting in your inventory the entire game even when you aren't using them. It's also strange to me that these are even accessories at all. When you equip these, you're taking away certain mechanics of the game. You don't get to equip some accessories that you get later that would work with specific builds because you have the timely accessories equipped. If I have a problem with reaction time and decide to equip that timely accessory, I am essentially removing one of my accessory slots and taking away part of the game that would be enjoyable. The game's easy mode, which is called story focused, automatically equips 2 of the timely accessories, which just adds to the confusion and makes people wonder if they really are accessibility options or just easy mode options. So overall, the accessories were a really good idea, but it needed to be more obvious to the player what they were, and they needed to be implemented in a more seamless way. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's finally talk about the game itself. It is very obvious where the budget of Final Fantasy XVI went. They wanted to tell a story through a very cinematic experience. They spent the majority of their time crafting a story and making sure that it is told in a way that everyone can understand and enjoy. I think they absolutely nailed this concept. Whether or not you're a Final Fantasy veteran or you've never played an RPG before, you can play Final Fantasy XVI and get so much out of the story. The plot is given to the player in a very digestible way. All of the characters' backstories are explained in almost a Netflix-esque way, and there's so many cutscenes and so much dialogue, but it all fits into a very nice narrative that is pretty well balanced and pretty well paced. One of the most important things about Final Fantasy XVI is that Square Enix understood the value of first impressions. In today's era of $70 games and service games galore, a lot of people will watch their favorite Twitch streamer or content creator play the first few hours of a game to decide if they want to buy it. Square Enix truly showed they were ready for this by making the beginning of the game a cinematic explosion. You got explosions, you got kaiju battles, you got characters dying, you got blood and gore, you got politics and backstabbing. It's all there within the first few hours. Not only that, but they released their own free demo just to show people that they weren't scared of people seeing the beginning of the game. I think that this went so far for Final Fantasy XVI's success. It seems like they finally understand, in today's world, what sells a video game. Now, I'm just going to leave it there for the story. I don't want to get too much into spoilers, but it is a very well-crafted story. Can be slow at parts, but you can blast through the main story without doing any of the side quests and have a pretty good understanding of what happened. What's awesome, though, is that the side quests genuinely add to the story and give the characters a lot of context and gives their feelings a lot of context. Some of the side quests, especially at the beginning of the game, are very throwaway, but especially the endgame side quests give you a ton of insight into characters, the world, and the intentions of a lot of the cast. Some people complained that the story is basically just Game of Thrones, but Square Enix never shied away from saying that they were directly influenced by Game of Thrones when making the story. I'm no Game of Thrones expert, so I can't really tell you if it crosses that line between just being inspired by Game of Thrones and straight up copying Game of Thrones, but I've seen a lot of posts about it, and it seems like in some ways it's inspired but does its own thing, and in some scenes it feels like it did kind of copy. Either way, I think going the Game of Thrones route was a genius idea to get a lot of the general audience excited about Final Fantasy again. It's been a long time since we've had a Final Fantasy game, and to get a lot of people excited about this one and hopefully venturing into some of the games of the past is overall a good thing. Now, I will say that one thing that I personally missed from the story is just kind of that Final Fantasy vibe. It has the crystals, and it has the summons, and it has characters that feel like they fit in a Final Fantasy game. But there's one special thing about Final Fantasy that, when I was a kid, really brought me into the series, and that was that feeling of like strangers from different lands coming together with all of their different tools and abilities to defeat some kind of central evil. You kind of have that in this game, but just like Final Fantasy 15, it feels like the characters already knew each other, and you don't really get that sense of like strangers having to work together to defeat the evil and save humanity. It feels more like they were just destined from the start to do so. It's a bit of a silly concept, I know. Even the original Final Fantasy just had 4 fated warriors that had to defeat evil, but it's something special to me that I feel like Final Fantasy 2 all the way up to Final Fantasy 14 had, and the new Final Fantasies just don't have that same feeling. I will admit, one of the final scenes, which I won't show here, has a bunch of the characters kind of like grouping together for the final battle with the epic boss, and it did kind of give me that Final Fantasy vibe a little bit. I'd also really like to praise the active time lore feature. This feature allows you to read up on specific things in the story as they're happening, and this was a godsend. I absolutely love this feature, and I want to see it in more games. The thing with these more political and medieval games for me is that I always forget the names of the characters and the names of the kingdoms and which characters belong with which kingdom, and it takes me so long to get it all figured out that I end up missing a lot of the story. With this active time lore feature, I was able to specifically target each character and say, okay, I just saw that character, this character is from this kingdom, and I was able to organize it all in my head in a way that I was then able to accept a lot more of what the game was throwing at me because I wasn't constantly asking these questions. This goes back to what I was saying before about Square crafting a story that is really easily digestible by everyone. Whether or not this is your first RPG ever, you have stuff like the active time lore system, you have the timeline system that shows you exactly how events are going on as they're going on, and you have tomes to explain everything about everything as you see it. Overall, it is a very good story. It does have its flaws. Some people like to point out that the way it handles specific themes like slavery was a bit questionable, but it is a very enjoyable story and a very easy one to go through. So if you know anything about me, you know that I'm all about the characters. When it comes to the plot or the themes of the game, I'm always super invested in the characters to see how they interact with each other and how they interact with the world. The characters of Final Fantasy XVI are really, really good. They're exciting, memorable, have great arcs, good writing, and fall in line with what we expect out of a Square Enix character. Clive is a great main character and has all of the traits that you would expect out of a Final Fantasy main character. As the player, we get to see firsthand his values and morals through his younger self. And although he sticks to those core values, he still goes through changes as a character. Joshua is an amazingly cool character, and you're always on the edge of your seat whenever he's in a scene. As with many Final Fantasy games though, the villains steal the show. Benedicta has quickly become a favorite among fans, and Annabelle is a master class in how to create a hateable villain. The main antagonist of the game is a bit more of a question mark. Some people like him, some people don't. But his design is incredible, and from the moment you see him, you are locked in to everything he says. I personally really fell in love with Annabella's character. There's a scene near the beginning of the game where she's talking to Elwyn, and it is just a joy to see how real these characters feel in these newer games. As somebody who studied communication, it is incredible to see how Annabella's tones and nonverbals change throughout the scene as her tactics change to try to get what she wants out of Elwyn. One criticism I saw online about the story was about the female characters and how they aren't really empowered enough in the story. And I gotta be honest, I don't really see it. If you think that the female characters weren't powerful enough in this game, I'd be willing to hear the argument. I don't think it's completely out of the question, but for me personally, I didn't get that vibe at all. For starters, Jill is incredibly strong and is described as incredibly strong throughout the entire story. There's the scene where she gives up her powers to Clive, but I didn't see this as a scene where she's showing any weakness. In fact, I see it as her showing her strength. She's willing to give up some of her power, even though she's in danger, because she knows it's going to be for the greater good. I think that too many people were hung up on the fact that she was giving her powers over to a man. The fact that Clive is a man doesn't matter. That's not the point of the scene. She's giving up her power to the greater good, to save the world. It just happens to be going to Clive because he's the main character. I think it's safe to say that this scene is not some kind of meta commentary on females being submissive to men or something. Now, I do admit that Jill kind of falls off near the end of the game, but there is an extra side quest tree that ends up giving her kind of a final moment in the story that a lot of people probably didn't unlock because there's a lot of side quests. Also, I gotta be honest, I don't know how anyone says that the female characters are weak in this game when Annabella exists. Just watch the scene where she's sitting next to the king talking to Dion and tell me that the female characters are weak in this game. She commands ultimate authority whenever she's in the room, and I think she is one of the most imposing female characters I've ever seen in a game. I will say that the ending of her character is a bit abrupt. It kind of comes out of nowhere, but I think that was kind of the point. She's so obsessed with what she wants that when she realizes she can't get it, she just instantly crumbles in front of us. And Cid, oh man, like Cid, dude, they did Cid justice in this game. Finally, a Cid that feels like the Cids of old. He is basically the secondary hero of the story, and every time he's in a scene, he commands your attention. They have created a Cid that everyone looks up to and inspires to be, even the characters in the game. And I think one of the most impressive things about this character roster is just how big it is, and yet most of the characters are extremely memorable. I mean, you can just rattle off characters like Mid, Otto, Gav, Kupka. Everyone's gonna have a favorite in there. Now, I said that it was obvious that the budget of this game went towards the story, the characters, the cinematics. So did the gameplay suffer heavily from this huge emphasis on story? Well, it did, but more in the mechanic side, which we'll talk about later. In terms of just the gameplay of your first playthrough of the game, it's surprisingly good, although maybe a bit shallow. The gameplay loop of Final Fantasy XVI is pretty basic. It pretty much goes, watch cinematics, do fights, watch cinematics, do fights, watch cinematics, go back to home base, watch cinematics, do fights, go back to home base, watch cinematics, do fights. They did craft an open world that you can visit and explore whenever you want to, but unfortunately, there's not much reason to. For the most part, you'll just be playing through the story, and at specific points, the game will open up to allow you to do side quests. Unfortunately, the early side quests in this game are terrible. They're boring, they don't really contribute to the story at all. Most of them are just walk around this area and give things to an NPC. If you're lucky, you'll have to travel somewhere where you've already been to fight exactly one enemy encounter, pick up an item, and bring it back to the NPC. And the rewards for doing these side quests are almost always completely useless. A lot of the people I talked to only tried a few of the side quests, realized how bad they were, and then just slammed through the rest of the story. Which is a huge shame because the side quests do get better later. Near about the halfway point of the game, the side quests start to get really interesting and talk a lot about the lore of the world and give characters a lot of backstory and context. Near the end of the game, there's even some side quests that I would recommend everyone watch just to get a better understanding of the main story. The gameplay of the side quests also gets better. Nothing crazy, but you'll be fighting some mini-boss enemies that are copies of bosses you fought in the main story, maybe with an extra attack or with some goons alongside with them. The rewards also get slightly better, and you also get some permanent upgrades through some of the side quests. The combat is exactly what we were told it was going to be. It's DMC-inspired combo action. And I gotta say, it's pretty impressive. It's flashy, it's fun to pull off combos, it's fun to try different builds of abilities. I've talked to many people about their specific builds, and it seems like everyone went with something different, which is a good sign. Everything is pretty balanced throughout the game, and after you're done with the game, there are some crazy meta broken combos that you can try, which is a good thing. For a one-player game, you want to have some crazy strong stuff that you can experiment with. There is no inherent issue with the game being an action game if it can pool all of the things that make Final Fantasy fun into this new gameplay style. And that's really where Final Fantasy XVI drops the ball. If you look at something like the Final Fantasy VII Remake, sure, it's not a turn-based RPG like the game that it remade, but it takes so many of the things that make Final Fantasy VII fun and puts them into an action RPG. Leveling up your materia to unlock new abilities, building a strategy with your materia and equipment before entering a battle, hitting your character with buffs or hitting the enemy with status effects to help turn the tide of battle, memorable attacks that are specific to one character, party mechanics and using the right character at the right time, characters specializing in specific moves and specific abilities, finding an enemy's weakness and using a specific element, ailment, or type of attack to take it down, enemies with specific gimmicks that you have to learn and adapt to in order to win. All of these things are in the Final Fantasy VII Remake and make you feel like you're playing Final Fantasy VII even though you're playing the remake. Now, Final Fantasy XVI isn't a remake. It is an entry in the series, so it doesn't need to do exactly what the previous games did. But at the same time, it needs to fit into the series and have some of those gameplay elements that we're used to. The problem with Final Fantasy XVI is it almost feels like someone played the rest of the Final Fantasies and said, let's try to do the exact opposite of what made those games fun. Final Fantasy XVI almost feels like the anti-Final Fantasy. Like, hey, we can do everything different and it can still be a good game. That would be cool if it were a different IP, but for Final Fantasy XVI, that shouldn't be the goal. We'll talk about it more when we get into the mechanics of the game, but almost everything I just listed about the Final Fantasy VII Remake is completely gone in Final Fantasy XVI. Final Fantasy XVI focuses on precision dodging, enemy management, combos, and pressing the right buttons at the right time. And although action game fans will feel right at home, it's hard for Final Fantasy fans to play Final Fantasy XVI without at least having a small feeling of, wow, this just isn't Final Fantasy. It's hard to make the argument that this ruins the game completely, but honestly, it's so different than other Final Fantasy games that it almost feels like false advertising, and fans have a right to be frustrated with that. Another gameplay thing I would like to talk about are the big cinematic battles that happen during the big story sequences of the game. These sequences can feel a bit drawn out when you're playing through them multiple times, but man are they awesome the first time you experience them. You can really feel the scale of these battles. They look incredible, sound incredible. These were the types of scenes that we dreamed about when playing the old Final Fantasy games. Some of these fights are so action-packed that they're borderline anime battles, which kind of goes against the whole Game of Thrones feel of the game. But you know what? I'm here for it. These fights are so entertaining. The last gameplay thing I wanted to talk about is the hunt system. These types of systems are my bread and butter, and although I'm really happy to see that Final Fantasy XVI at least has a system like this, again, it's pretty shallow. The good thing about the hunt system is that it gives the player some reason to go back and explore previous areas. And some of the hunts even have hidden locations, forcing the player to do even more exploration to find them. The battles, however, are mostly just rehashes of fights you've already done, and none of them are really any more difficult than the bosses you'll be fighting throughout the game. There are a few standout hunts, but unfortunately none of them have any kind of special gimmick or any reason really to fight them. They're just extra fights. There are no real post-game hunts, no hunts that you're supposed to fight after the final boss that give you any kind of special challenge, and in fact, there's not much post-game to talk about at all. There is a New Game Plus mode, but it is incredibly shallow. There's an arcade mode, but it's basically just playing the story missions again, but with points. And the trials are fun once, but nothing that you're really going to want to go back to. It honestly makes sense that this game doesn't have much of a post-game. So much of the development and thought process behind this game was for that one playthrough that you do of the story. However, long-term fans of the series want to see some reason to continue playing the game. A lot of the previous entries have a ton of post-game or reasons to go through the game again and try different classes or try different builds, whatever. And this game just doesn't have that. It's kind of just a one and done. Fortunately, that one playthrough is a really lengthy one. In fact, if you do all of the side quests, it's even longer. So I don't think that a lot of people are going to be complaining about not getting their money's worth. But I wish that there was just one big post-game challenge that we could use all of these skills that we learned throughout the game and really push ourselves to the limit. I mean, action games are notorious for having some type of super difficult challenge at the end of the game to test all of these mechanics that you've learned throughout. Unfortunately, the New Game Plus mode and the extra difficulty mode, Final Fantasy mode, doesn't do much to challenge a player that's already gone through the game once. Alright, it's finally time to talk about the mechanics of the game. Remember earlier when I said that it was going to get heated? This game has one of the worst equipment systems I've ever seen in a video game. And it's Final Fantasy XVI. Listen, Doom Eternal, a game whose sole purpose is to keep you out of menus so that you continue to shoot demons, has a better and more detailed equipment system than the new Final Fantasy game. Marduk RPG, a Flash game made in 2007 for free by one guy, has a more detailed equipment system than the newest Final Fantasy game. There are a lot of things that I am willing to give Square Enix the benefit of the doubt for with this game. I understand that they wanted to make a big, bombastic, epic game that fit into what people are looking for in video games right now and keep that Final Fantasy flavor going. I understand that not everything could be perfect, but this is unacceptable. This is the one thing that I cannot give Square Enix a pass for. If I'm the director of the game and my team came up to me and showed me this, delay the game. And I know that not everything can be solved by delaying the game. I know there's a lot of nuance in that. Like, you can't just delay the game every time there's a problem until the game is absolutely perfect. There's deals that have to be done. The game has to be made at a certain time. I understand that. I don't care. I see this. Delay the game. This equipment system is completely unacceptable. It honestly feels like they made the story and an action combat system to go with it, and then at the very last second decided that the Final Fantasy fans would be too upset if there wasn't some kind of RPG mechanic in the game, and very quickly created this just to give us an illusion that the game is an RPG. So why is the equipment system so bad? Well, first of all, you only get your sword, 2 pieces of armor, and then your accessories. The sword has its attack damage and its stagger damage, and both pieces of equipment have an HP buff and a defense buff. That is the entire equipment system. No weapon has any kind of special effect on it, and no armor has any kind of special effect or different stat lines on it. The game is structured in a way where you are always getting the same exact weapons at the same exact times. And in fact, when you play the game through on New Game Plus, you get the same exact weapons again at the same exact times, just with different names and buffed stats. They were so meticulous to make sure that you get the same exact equipment at the same exact time that the game stays balanced throughout, and there's basically no player choice left. All of the weapons have the same exact attack damage and stagger damage. There are no weapons that do more attack damage or more stagger damage or have any kind of special effects attached to them. The armor sometimes has a little bit more HP buff than defense buff or vice versa, but the numbers are so hilariously small, like giving you plus 2 HP when you have several thousand HP, that none of it ever matters. About a quarter through the game automatically gives you a sword and 2 pieces of armor that are so strong that you will not find anything better for hours after receiving them. On very rare occurrences, you will find equipment that's better than what you have, or be able to craft something better than what you have from doing hunts or side quests, but all the numbers are so small that it never feels good to do so. The game also force feeds you items from some of the bosses that you fight to give you specific weapons that will always be the best thing to currently use. The only customization that comes from your equipment are the accessories, and they are also super bland and uninteresting. The game has no elements. It might look like it has elements like fire and wind, but all of the damage in the game is just that, damage. And the game has no buffs or ailments, other than the very specific buffs that specific enemies give in certain battles. So these accessories are basically boiled down to, this attack does 5% more damage, this attack does 5% more stagger damage, etc. There are only a few accessories that have any kind of unique effect on the gameplay. Basically, a player is just going to pick the accessories that they feel like fits their build the best, but there won't be any equipping stuff for certain battles, or equipping fire resistance to take care of a fire boss, or equipping poison resistance to deal with some poison enemy. All of that kind of stuff is gone. You're probably going to equip 3 accessories that you like, and then never touch them again unless you get something really special later. The effects of this equipment are so minor that you can forget to touch your equipment for multiple hours and not see any difference on your gameplay. In fact, all of the numbers in this game are so forcibly balanced that 90% of the bosses you fight are going to be a 2 stagger and kill scenario. In an attempt to make a post-game challenge for myself, I played through the entire game twice through New Game Plus on the hardest difficulty, then fought the final hunt in the game with no equipment at all and the starting weapon. Even with that insane handicap, it only took me 5 staggers to defeat the King Behemoth. Now admittedly, those staggers took a little while to pull off, and I did the entire battle without taking any damage, meaning that the armor didn't matter, but you can see how little the equipment actually affects the game. Think about other RPGs where you could play through the entire game and then again on New Game Plus and set it to a super hard difficulty. How much damage would your starting equipment be doing? The game is action and story focused, so I didn't really expect a super expansive equipment system. But what really frustrates me is that they could have taken the time to make this so much better with very little effort on their part. They could have given some of the buffs that accessories give to some of the pieces of armor. They could have had some of the weapons work better with certain icons. They could have had the armor give boosts to other stats, or maybe just not give HP at all but give a bunch of defense, or vice versa. The most obvious change would be to simply have some of the weapons do more attack damage and less stagger damage, or vice versa, instead of having all of them do the exact same attack and stagger. To be fair, I don't think that would have changed things very much, but at least it would have given the illusion to the player that they were making some kind of RPG decision. For example, when you get Garuda for the first time, Garuda is really good at stagger damage, so the player could have looked at that and said, oh, maybe I should equip the weapon that does more damage and less stagger to kind of balance out this new icon I just got. And you know what? I kind of lied to you, because there is one weapon in the entire game that gives more attack than stagger. It's called the Enhancer. And you know what? I am 1000% convinced that this was a typo. I refuse to believe that Square Enix thought that giving a single weapon 15 more attack than stagger was a good idea to diversify the equipment in the game. But more importantly, when you play through the entire game again on New Game Plus and get the reforged version of all the weapons, which is basically just the weapon again with higher numbers, the reforged version of the Enhancer has a normal stat line again. So, I'm convinced. It was a typo. What else is there to say? As I said in the gameplay section, a lot of battles just boil down to 2 staggers and kill, no matter what equipment you have equipped and no matter what build you have. The game is almost too balanced for its own good. It never wants to force you to try new builds, it just wants you to do whatever is comfortable for you and make sure that you can still get away with the win. This is honestly pretty good for new players, but for veterans of the Final Fantasy series, we're used to being punished for not thinking about a battle before we go into it. And in Final Fantasy XVI, it's quite the opposite. The game will never punish you for playing the game the way you want to play it. In fact, the game will not punish you much at all. It's a pretty easy game and doesn't really have any post-game content that poses a threat. If you die during one of those big cinematic boss battles, the game will always place you in the phase of the fight that you already were in and replenish your items for you. If you die during any other fight, it will always allow you to retry that fight immediately unless you're playing the hardest version of the arcade mode. The game has a very specific way that it wants you to experience it. And to be fair, it's a very fun experience, but you're not going to get much variety when playing through the game again on repeated playthroughs. The only thing you can really do is try different skill builds, but a lot of times people find a skill build that fits their playstyle and just stick with it. I do like how you can reset your ability points whenever you want to try different builds, but this also means that you get enough ability points to get all of the abilities you want pretty early on in the game, since you can always just refund every other ability and put the points into the ones you need. It does need to be said though that the mechanics of the actual combat are really well done. The precision dodges feel really good to pull off, hitting a huge stagger bonus is a great feeling, and whoever decided to display the total stagger damage you did during a stagger deserves a raise. Honestly, without that one little detail, I think the combat would have gotten really stale really fast. A lot of boss fights, I didn't care as much about defeating the boss as I did trying to see how high I could get that number to go. Whenever I got a new ability, I didn't really care about using it on the next boss, because to be honest, it doesn't matter what abilities you use on the boss. You could equip all of the starting abilities and beat the boss just fine. But maybe through using this ability with that ability, I can get that stagger bonus just a little bit higher. That realization you get when you defeat an icon in the story and realize that you're about to get a whole new skill tree is always really satisfying. I even liked the quick time events in the battles. I never felt like they overstayed their welcome. My only real complaint is just how easy they are to pull off. Enemy management in the small mob fights is pretty fun. My only complaint are the buffs that the enemies get, which really didn't amount to anything. There were so many other things they could have done to make these fights more interesting, but instead, sometimes enemies get protect and you have to break it. Sometimes enemies get cured and you have to go out of your way to go kill the guy that's doing the curing first. That's really it. Other than that, you're just spamming your abilities as you always do. I don't really have a ton to say about the graphics in the game. I think that for the most part, they look great and fit in with other PS5 games and fit in with AAA titles of the time. The game likes to do a lot of close-ups on characters, and they always look really fantastic. During the cutscenes, I was really impressed with character facial movements and nonverbals. It really seems like they focused on making these characters feel like real people. The only complaint there is that the characters can look a bit stiff when in the in-engine cutscenes. One thing I gotta say is that the game doesn't perform perfectly. It may perform better after future updates, but I can only review the game based on what I bought for $70. And what I bought for $70 is a game that runs mostly at 60 FPS, but dips now and again. Also, I don't know if this was an issue across the board, but I know for myself and a couple other people, the game looked noticeably worse on quality mode. Having said that, it's a full game, it functions fine, I never had any crashes or issues like that, and that's honestly all I can ask for in 2023. It sounds a bit silly to say this, but I give Square Enix so much credit for just making a full, complete game with no service model whatsoever, no transactions whatsoever, just a full, complete video game that works on launch. Also, I touched on it before, but those big epic battles during the story really push the graphics to their limit. They are so awesome to look at and even watch multiple times. The music in this game is fantastic, and I wouldn't expect anything less of Square Enix. At this point, I think Square Enix is the absolute #1 when it comes to consistently good and varied soundtracks in their games. The only thing to note about the Final Fantasy XVI soundtrack is that it's a bit more ambience heavy and not so much like banger songs like Final Fantasy games of old. You get a lot more low-key melodic music instead of the catchy tunes of Final Fantasy past. I think this honestly fits Final Fantasy XVI though. It's more of a cinematic experience, so the more movie-style soundtrack kind of fits. And honestly, once the soundtrack gets going, it really gets going. There is one boss theme in the game that I could not help but hum every single time I heard it. The game also uses a lot of piano in its soundtrack, which I personally really enjoyed, and it also uses the Final Fantasy theme a ton throughout a lot of the songs. They maybe even used it a bit too much to the point where it's almost like trying to remind you that this is actually a Final Fantasy game, but I didn't mind it. The way that they interwove it into certain songs and had it hit during big moments in the story was really cool. The sound in the game seemed fine to me. I saw some complaints of people saying that some of the weapon sound effects felt a bit generic, but I thought it all sounded okay. My one issue with the sound is that everyone in this game whispers. I don't know if they just got this idea by copying Netflix movies, but all of the dialogue gets really quiet when there isn't any background sounds. Speaking of the dialogue, I thought the voice acting was really great in this game, and you can tell that they put a lot of effort into it. The big standout is Ralph Ineson as Cid, and funnily enough, he also voiced Lorath in Diablo 4, which was out around the same time. It was kind of interesting to hear his voice in both games at once. I did hear some complaints about Clive and how he can kind of Batman his way through some scenes, but that never bothered me, and when he did need to show emotion, he did it really well. In fact, that emotion maybe even felt a bit bigger because of how he's a bit emotionless during some of the other scenes. So overall, Final Fantasy XVI was an amazing experience the first time through. One that will stay memorable for a long time, but won't really pull a lot of people in to play more than once. I think Final Fantasy XVI was a perfect game for the market as it stands, and there's no wonder why it was really successful. I think that it is a game that will get a lot of new people into the Final Fantasy series, although it may not really show them what the Final Fantasy series is all about. I think that if you are an old-time Final Fantasy fan who is willing to try an action game, you'll have a lot of fun with this. But if you're an old-time Final Fantasy fan that really plays Final Fantasy for specific reasons, you're not going to find a lot of that in this new game. I think the game is a great value, and it won't let you down if you like this type of game. I do have to say though, I think Square Enix is on a bit of a thin sheet of ice when it comes to its fans. I think for a first attempt at a cinematic action experience, this game does well. But if Final Fantasy XVII is another one of these, there's going to be some serious problems. The next game needs to do a better job capturing what's fun about Final Fantasy and putting it into an action game. It needs to have deeper mechanics that are more RPG focused to reflect the series that it's a part of. However, the things that Square Enix focused on in this game really paid off in a big way, and I think that a lot of people will remember it for a long time because of those things. I also think that a DLC that is specifically designed to patch up some of these things that were left out of the original game could really go a long way. It would be awesome to see a DLC that had some more unique equipment, some super difficult boss battles that really tested our mastery of the game, and maybe even some story segments with characters that we want to see more of. But in terms of rating the game as is, if I had to give it a number, I would give it something like an 8 out of 10. I would love to give it more than that, but unfortunately, it misses out on hitting what's important about the Final Fantasy series and alienates a lot of its own fans. Plus, the equipment system being so bare bones is just unacceptable for me. Regardless of whether or not it's a Final Fantasy game, this is a game in 2023. The equipment should be more than just 2 numbers. The entire gameplay loop feels super manufactured. They want you to have very specific damage and very specific experiences with each boss, and they didn't really plan for any kind of experience after the game is over. But like I said, manufactured or not, the first experience you have with the game is going to be an awesome one, and I have to give them credit for that. It's a shame that Final Fantasy XVI couldn't be like a lot of first games on systems past. For example, Final Fantasy VII being the first PS1 game and having one of the most revolutionary equipment systems ever with the Materia system. Or even Final Fantasy X, the first PS2 game, which had one of the most revolutionary level-up systems ever, the Sphere Grid. I feel like Final Fantasy XVI could have been that. It could have been this huge cinematic experience, but with a DMC-style combat system, but then RPG mechanics on top of that. Unfortunately, they dropped the ball on getting all of that to combine together, and instead it just feels like your run-of-the-mill action game with a really epic story. The game isn't bland, but it doesn't stand out like other Final Fantasy games that really push the envelope of the time. It just feels like a very good action game. I wouldn't say that the story necessarily plays it safe, but it just kind of copies what worked in media at the time and doesn't try to do anything special. It doesn't really feel like the story was trying to say something special from the hearts of the people that created it. It feels like they were trying to tell a story that would be exciting for the people playing it. Something that would speak to them and be successful. But the game is very well put together and very fun, and I really enjoyed my time with it. So that is it. That is my review of Final Fantasy XVI. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I would love to hear what you have to say about all the things I covered in this video down in the comments below. Like I said, the public discourse of this game is going to be really, really important, and Square Enix is going to take what worked in this game and what didn't work in this game, and it's going to directly influence what happens in Final Fantasy XVII. So please leave your thoughts down below. I would love to read them. Also, quick shout out, I did a talk with Dan SG08 about Final Fantasy XVI, just kind of a casual talk going over our experiences with the game, and I'm going to be putting that on my Patreon. The Patreon is only $1 to get access to all of the videos on the Patreon, so that includes that. So please go check out the Patreon if you want to support me and see that. Also, my big patrons over here, thank you guys so much. You're the ones that make all of this possible, so thank you so much for that. And that's really all I have to say. I'm looking forward to continuing this journey through Final Fantasy with you. I love to hear all of your opinions on everything, and we'll see you in the next video.